Hello everyone, TLSG here, back again with another Marvel Snap video. We were unable to pull a mystery card today, but we do have a new featured location, being Nidavellir, and you may have seen it in our last video, but this new location is so critical. It can really swing games. Playing around this location, especially while it's a featured location, seems very important, and it can get you a lot of cubes really quickly. So since we were unable to pull a mystery card today, it became a day of experimentation. We tried several different decks, several different builds. We even made an entire video, an entire 35 minute video that we ended up scrapping just because it relied too much on luck, and it just didn't feel competitive. I would have hated for you guys to try it and then lose a bunch of cubes just because I got a lucky draw and you didn't, or something like that. So I went back to the drawing board, and from that drawing board we came up with this deck. This deck does a lot of things really well, and it plays around our featured location very well as well. Is that right? So the main ideas behind the deck, with Nidavellir buffing up every single card that is there, there's two routes that you can take to swinging or winning that lane. You can either drop a red skull to push the opponent's cards that are over there over that 9 power limit. So if the location gives you 5 power, red skull is going to give their cards 2 additional power, so that's 7. To be able to get them within Shang-Chi range, they only have to have a base power of 2. So that's the ultimate high sweep style combo, and we don't get that every time, but we have plenty of other combos that make this deck still shine. So on games that we don't get our red skull Shang-Chi combo, we can also win that lane by not dropping many resources into it until the very last turn. The very last turn, we can drop something like a Maximus and a Brood, a buffed up Brood, and end up getting like 30 something power and just sneaking it into the lane when the opponent didn't think we were competing for that lane at all. And so really quickly running through the general idea of the deck, we have Okoye and Nakia, which are going to act as buffs. Okoye is going to buff your deck, and Nakia is going to buff the cards in your hand. And then the last buff that we have is Forge. So Forge on reveal, give the next card you play plus 2 power. So we want to use this right before we drop something like a Brood or a Mr. Sinister. Unfortunately, it doesn't have very good interaction with Mysterio in that it only buffs the first copy of Mysterio that's played, whether it's a token or the real one. It only buffs the far left one. We have the one cost 0. So 0 on reveal, remove the abilities on the next card you play. So this is going to give us a buffer in being able to drop our red skull and not have the downside for those games where we don't have a solid Shang-Chi play, but we still want to have a high power drop on turn 5. We have Mr. Sinister and Brood. So Mr. Sinister is going to create one copy of himself, an exact duplicate, but that exact duplicate doesn't have abilities. So if it's in something like Washington, D.C., then he performs well there. And then Brood is going to create 2 Broodlings at that location. So it's going to copy itself 2 times, basically. Then we have Mysterio. Mysterio is going to play a copy of itself in each of the 3 lanes, as long as it's not locked by the location. So Mysterio can't go into lanes where you wouldn't be able to play him naturally. So if it's been locked out by Storm, you're not able to play or put a Mysterio token in that lane. And then we have Shang-Chi, which is going to act as our board removal. This new location really pushes people to drop some high power, high quality cards, and you can sneak and steal a game by dropping Shang-Chi there on the very last turn, completely swinging that location in your favor. We have Iron Man, who's going to push those games that we don't Shang-Chi their lane, we don't get a great play line. Maybe we just drop a buffed up Brood in a regular lane. We can follow up with an Iron Man who's going to push and propel that lane a lot higher than it would have been otherwise. And then lastly, we have Taskmaster. So Taskmaster is going to be the ideal target for dropping after we drop Red Skull, in that it's going to copy Red Skull's power level, but none of the downside. So we could use this on Red Skull. We could even do it to a lesser extent on Maximus. It'll be between 7 and 10 power if we copy the Maximus, which isn't terrible for a 5 cost drop. But that is the general idea of the deck. Let's go ahead and jump in. Okay, so first up we have Term, and we do draw into our Okoye. It doesn't necessarily matter where we would drop Okoye, but we are going to drop Okoye on the first turn anytime she is in our hand. And so then we do have Forge and Mr. Sinister. I kind of want to wait a turn though, to see if we can draw into Nakia. There's not necessarily a rush to pump this deck out really quickly. A lot of its power is going to come from kind of sneaking those tokens in when your opponent's not expecting it. And so we do get the lucky upside of drawing into our Nakia here. So I think we drop our Nakia into Hellfire Club, And then we see what X-Mansion is going to drop. We're going to see if we get the high roll of X-Mansion, if we get the low roll, and then we're going to play from there. And so Nakia, of course, buffing our cards in hand. So we're going to have a pretty big brood to play off of. So they get a Mr. Fantastic, and we get a Beast. So I kind of wish we would have dropped Nakia there. We would have then been able to drop a second Nakia for 1 cost instead of 3, and it really would have swung the game. And so I think that they're getting close to being capped out, but I don't think we necessarily drop our brood in that lane. We're going to be able to do something like a Mr. Sinister and Iron Man to finish that lane out, I think, would be a good play line. So do we wait a turn and drop it with brood, or do we go ahead and start initiating our takeover of the X-Mansion? And I think we do. I don't think we necessarily wait for the perfect brood drop, because it's still going to be 15 power regardless of if it's buffed up by Forge or not. It is going to be a 15 power brood, which is huge. That's a really big brood to throw onto the board, and especially at 3 cost, we can sneak it in the last turn if we need to. And so I think we do probably drop our Iron Man here, and we keep the brood as kind of like a secret right now. We see what they get from their Mr. Sinister drop, and then we kind of go from there. So they lock down that left lane. Interesting. So that's scary, because if they got, let's say, an inversed Iron Man, that becomes really difficult to play against. And then what else could they have gotten? It runs a Devil Dino. Maybe they got a Devil Dino. And we have initiation, so we can't even try to high roll and drop a Shang-Chi and hope that we hit it. But I think we do need to see this one play out. I think they probably win here. But unless they have the high roll, they have a blue Marvel. Okay. And so then what do they drop in X-Mansion? A rock? It's not your ideal first game. It's not necessarily that exciting either, but yeah. I guess 2 cubes are 2 cubes. All right, so next up we have Ignis, and we draw into our Okoye. I think we're going to drop Okoye into mid. The vault is going to allow us to move cards over there on turn 6, and so I don't necessarily want to flood that location in case we need to make a strategic power shift. And so they drop an Angel, and typically that tells me they're running something like a Death Wave. And so we need to keep an eye out for how many cards they do get destroyed. And so then they drop a Bucky Barnes, and so I would not be surprised if they're running a Death Wave. Death Wave being a pretty strong and pretty consistent deck right now. And we do get lucky, and we get the Nakia. So we're going to drop Nakia into Strange Academy and hope that it gets pushed into the Crimson Cosmos. But if not, we are able to drop quite a few cards into the Crimson Cosmos fairly easily with like a Red Skulled zeroed Red Skull, and then several others. So we get Forge here. Do we ever kind of manipulate the odds a little bit in our favor? Or maybe we don't need to. Maybe we can do something like a 0 and then a Maximus. Next turn, we can do a Taskmaster into the Crimson Cosmos, and then that's going to lead us to the end of turn 5, where these cards will be pushed off, and then we can finish turn 6 off with a Forge Brood, which is going to give us a 20 power Strange Academy. That is going to be really, really hard to anticipate. I like the play line, so I'm going to go ahead and snap off of it. And then we do get a pretty decent Maximus without the downside of them drawing cards because we have our 0. Okay, and so then they swept their cards already, so they have 2 cards destroyed. And then they have the Adam Warlock, which is going to draw them an additional card here, unfortunately. Had we gotten 1 additional power over there, it wouldn't have been able to do that. So this is tough. This is tricky. So since they have the extra card, and they have 2 cards that they destroyed, do we think that they're going to drop Wave this turn? If they have it, they're going to drop Wave. That way they can do a Death and a Chavez drop. But if we miss this opportunity to get 10 power, it's not going to come back. We could either do the Forge drop now, and then do we ever do something like this, which allows us to drop a Mr. Sinister that's buffed up next turn, and we can get at least 10 power out of that one, and that stops him from getting any additional cards with Adam Warlock here. We're going to go ahead and do that. We're going to hope that they don't have Wave in hand, which they dropped 2 cards. So they dropped the Hood and they dropped Killmonger. Okay, and so we don't have major cards with our 1-drops, so it's okay that those got destroyed other than discounting their death. And so that was 1, 2, 3. They're getting close to being able to drop a death regardless. And so, like I said at the start of the video, the interaction with Forge and Mysterio is pretty poor. It's only going to buff up the first token or first version that's played. And so in this case, that would be right here. We are going to go ahead and drop our Mr. Sinister here, which would have given us 10. And we did have this lane locked down. We just needed to keep the lead on one of the other 2. So we do get a game with Nidavellir as our first location. And so that's going to be a pretty big target, or a swing target. And we have the Red Skull Shang-Chi combo piece. So if we want to wait until turn 5 and they have resources here, we can do the Red Skull, the Shang-Chi, and that's going to leave us 2 energy left. So we'll still be able to drop something like Mr. Sinister if we want to. And so we're going to pass this turn. We're going to see if we can draw into Nakia before we start dropping our resources. And then Hala being the second location, and then Miniaturized Lab. Oof. That's a tough one, because we're not able to drop anything into Miniaturized Lab. Dropping anything into Nidavellir feels pretty bad. It doesn't feel great because of the fact that if we sweep it, we're going to sweep it with 2 cards, and we're not really going to need any additional power in that lane. And then dropping Maximus doesn't feel great here either, because that's going to give them 2 cards that they can draw into. But maybe we lean in. We hope that they don't drop too big of resources into Hala. And they drop a Wave here. And then we draw into our Nakia. And they have Initiation. I think we high roll here. I think we go for the high roll. So they dropped Wave. That's going to allow them to drop something pretty large, maybe like a Devil Dino, which they would have been able to anyway. So maybe like a 6-drop card. And I think they dropped that 6-drop card here. And then we'll go with a Nakia buff into a Forge, like a Forge Mr. Sinister after this, if we're able to win Hala. If not, then we may need to tuck tail and run. But I think that's what we do. If they drop a large card here, we'll be able to kill it. Let's say they drop an Odin, actually. Ooh. So if they drop an Odin, that's going to give them 11. That'll give us 11, so we'll tie. So, yep, I'm okay with that. And they don't. They drop a Vision. Wow. Okay, interesting. And so Vision is going to be able to be moved around the board as needed. And so what if we go with something like these 2? Next turn, we'll be able to do a Mr. Sinister and a buffed up Mysterio to kind of push out the rest of the win. And of course, we'll be able to get we'll be able to get the 12 power in the Mr. Sinister in this lane, and then the additional power with Mysterio. Oh, and so they lock down this location with Vision in place. So interesting. Okay, I would have anticipated them moving it out first or something. Interesting. Okay, so how do we win from here? That must mean that they're pretty confident that they can overcome the power level in one of these other lanes. So would it be more worthwhile to do a Mr. Sinister or a Brood here? So a Brood is going to be 12. This is going to be 12. But we get the additional token with Brood. And so if they do something like a Red Skull, and so the deck that I said we recorded and scrapped, largely based around the Red Skull combo and a Professor X combo, but Professor X just seems so difficult. So even if you lock down a lane, then how do you win the other lanes? You lose quite a bit of tempo in that, even if you ramp into it. And so we got lucky for like 6 games in a row, and I was like, oh, this is great. And then we played a little bit after editing that video, and it just didn't feel as great as I thought. And so that's why we scrapped it and went back to the drawing boards. So the first location we draw into is Kamar Taj, which is beautiful for this deck. If we can drop an Okoye, a Nakia, our Brood becomes massive. Our Red Skull becomes even larger. Our Shang-Chi becomes a decent power level for dropping. And so because of that potential upside, we're going to skip the first couple of turns and hope that we draw into Nakia here. If we can top deck into Nakia. Second dinner's looking out for me today. So we got the perfect RNG there. We flipped Wakanda Nemesis, which is going to buff our cards by +2. And then we drew Nakia, which is also going to buff the cards in our hand by +2. So we're going to snap off of that. We have a massive hand. We're going to end this game like right now. We're going to end it as soon as we possibly can. They're not going to want to compete. There's just no way that they can compete with something like, yeah. And so we snap off of that advantage. We should have snapped before we dropped Nakia, but something like a 8/6, a 24 power brood drop. If we don't do a forge, if we drew into a forge, it could be a 30 power brood drop. The Red Skull being 20 power in his own regard. Iron Man, 6 power. So that's all of a sudden a 12 power drop. Just nuts. Absolutely insane high roll. Next up we have Safety Blade, and we do draw into either the Red Skull Shang-Chi or the Zero Red Skull Iron Man piece of our combo. But we do need to keep in mind that Mindscape is going to flip our cards or switch our cards on the last turn. So we need to be aware or cognizant of that and kind of play around that. We want to drop our resources a little bit earlier than we normally would. And we want to say drop a Red Skull or not drop a Red Skull because we know we're going to send them Shang-Chi. Or we can drop our Red Skull into Mindscape and they have armor, so it doesn't matter. And so we do draw a Koye here, but we are kind of pushing our turns or the turns we have left. And so I know that at the end of next turn, we're going to want to drop our 0 so that we can turn 5 drop our Red Skull. And so I think maybe, but we won't be able to drop our Red Skull into the Avengers compound. And so it would be able to be Shang-Chi'd. So that feels pretty bad. I think maybe we drop I'm going to drop a Koye into Shadowland, our regular Mr. Sinister into the left-hand side. Oh, and they changed the Mindscape on us. So that really works in our favor here. That's going to give us a pretty large upside. And with them running something like armor, I have to think that maybe they're running like a destroyer deck, and they needed a way to drop their resources without them being destroyed by destroyer. And so next turn, all of our resources are going to have to be played into the Avengers compound. Do we ever not end this turn with 0? I think maybe we do something like a 0 here. Nope. I think maybe we just do brood and then 0, and then that's going to let us drop our Red Skull here if we want. We're going to be able to drop Iron Man here if we want. It just depends on how they play going into turn 5. So they do drop 2 cards into the Avengers compound this turn, even though it's going to be the only place we can drop cards next turn. And so we go into this last turn with the lead in 3 lanes. So that feels pretty good. And so I think if we extend our lead with Red Skull here, we can then expand our lead with an Iron Man to potentially... Okay, and so they drop a Moon Knight, which discards their Ghost Rider, so they're not going to be able to resummon whatever they dropped here. And they do cap out the Avengers compound as well, but ours is very, very largely over what they dropped. And so then we would finish this off with Iron Man. They would have to drop at least 8 power to win this lane, and then they would have to drop at least 1, and so it would be split. They'd have to drop 8 power in 4 cost, which becomes kind of difficult without the right tools or resources or kind of deck setup. Guys, we're gonna snap. We're gonna snap right off the bat. Next up, we have poor Hadex, which does not realize I'm sure they do not realize just how deep in it they just got. So we have Kamartaj as our first location, and we have Nakia in hand. And we draw into Forge, so we're going to be able to make some just absolutely massive cards. So we're going to skip all the way to turn 3, and maybe they have a Nakia in hand as well, but we're going to be able to do some pretty cool things in, like, let's say a Nakia here. We don't have any of our tokens necessarily, so maybe we have to end up doing something like a Mysterio, or even like a Maximus, a 0 Maximus gives us a lot of power into Kiln really, really quickly. And I don't think they're going to be able to compete with 19 power here. And then we draw into our Brood, but just a little bit too late. And then next turn we could end up dropping our Brood. Cards are going to cost 1 additional next turn. I think maybe we go with just a Mysterio play. So after this turn, I'm a little torn because we're not going to be able to, actually, nope. I don't know why we were thinking that we were making that too hard. So we're going to do 0 first. We didn't want to end this turn with playing 0. So we're going to drop 0 first. We're going to then drop Maximus. That's going to give us 19 power and no downside of them drawing any additional cards. And so unless they have something just absolutely huge, so they have 11 power here, but they're going to have to drop, they have 12 power. So they're going to have to be able to drop an additional 6 cards in the next 2 turns. And they only have 5 in hand. So they're going to have to play absolutely every card that they have to make this happen, unless of course they have a Mysterio. But it becomes really, really difficult to do. So do we drop our Forge here? Next turn we can do something like a Brood and a Mysterio token here. I think that's our best play line. With everything costing so much and with them running such a wide deck, if they don't drop a lot of resources, then Bishop doesn't get buffed up to the level he needs to. So they drop a Mojo and an Ant-Man. So they're going to cap out this location. So we know that we don't want to cap out this location. And this being the final turn, do we go with the Brood here, or just the one card? So they could potentially make us cap this lane out if they have like a Bishop, but with the Forge, so it's going to become 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 power Mysterio, and we're not going to have this lane capped out. And so then we just have to, they either have to play all of their cards. If they play all of their cards here, then they have a chance. So they have to play 4 cards to tie this lane. But I think we'll win this lane by a large enough margin. This one becomes 6. We could make it, actually, that just feels too bad. I think we do it this direction. That's going to let the Forge hit the Brood, which is going to become a 6. So this is going to be an 18 power lane. And this one would still be 9. I think that's the direction we want to go with it. So they do drop 4 cards here, which is going to push them up for the tie, unless they have another way to buff this lane, and in which case it feels kind of bad. But we do have our 22 power here. They have Stark Tower. They do drop some big cards in, like Hell Cow, but they're going to be able to come up over our power level, aren't they? No. So we overcome their power level here by 4. They overcome our power level in the Dream Dimension by 3. We push that right-hand side. Oh my gosh. The Swarm decks are unreal. We're just very fortunate that we had enough power that we pushed into Kiln, that we were able to hold that back, because just being able to drop 25 power in one lane and then a little bit of power in another lane in one turn was just, whew, that was such a close game, and it did not need to be. So very well played, Haydex. That was a lot closer than I thought it would have been whenever we first snapped right off the first turn. So we get a little bit of a high roll in Wakandan Embassy. We didn't get it late in the game, but we got it on our Nakia, who's going to buff the rest of our cards, and then at least she's not just a 1-drop that's kind of sitting on the board. And then we get Nidavellir as the featured location. That's going to let us do a Shang-Chi, especially if they drop the cards that were hit with Wakandan Embassy there. And so I think we pass this turn knowing that we have our Nakia in hand, and we don't necessarily try to force it here. And so they drop a Koye. That's not going to be able to be pushed up over the level to be Shang-Chi, even with a Red Skull. I think we drop our Nakia into the left lane. That's going to give us a buff on some of our cards. Nothing like, we don't hit anything like a Brood, but we get our Maximus, our Zero, our Shang-Chi. We're able to push out quite a bit of power still. And so I think we want to do something like an Okoye, a Forge, and then a Zero. That's going to allow us to drop Maximus next turn without any downside. Gives us a pretty big boost in our Zero on this left-hand lane, and gives us some flexibility on where we drop the rest of our power. And so they are running a Zoo as well. And so their Sunspot is almost to the point where we could hit it with a Shang-Chi. If we draw into a Red Skull here, we wouldn't be able to drop it where we need to. But we do draw into Iron Man. So do we still... No, we can't. Okay, so I'm torn. I do want to drop the Iron Man here to help win or swing this lane, but at the same time, we don't really have anything or any way to drop it without having a negative downside because we played our Zero. So do we just go mana inefficient here? We drop Maximus. Actually, I think they're going to play a lot of cards into Nidavellir this turn. So let's avoid Nidavellir. No, they cap out Onslaught Citadel. So even if we were able to hit these two, that's still 8, 16, that's still 24 power. That's in that lane. So I don't think we ever play that. They have initiation. So do we do something like this? Because if they drop a high power card here, or if they zoo to the point where their cards are buffed up, we'll be able to hit it with our Shang-Chi. Our Mr. Sinister is going to give us some additional power push, and then we just have to hope that 19 is enough to win that left location. So they do drop all of their resources into that mid, and so if they are going to have an empty hand, we're going to be able to get 2 of the 3 cards here destroyed with our Shang-Chi, and then we just have to hope that our Mr. Sinister, which is going to get 2 versions of the 5 power buff onto him, to help us swing this lane. And I think that is enough to do it. It kind of stuttered out a little bit there, but that is enough to swing it in our favor. Just very, very fortunate that they had such a lead that they had initiation, which allowed us to drop a preemptive Shang-Chi, knowing that it was the last turn, knowing that Nidavellir usually pushes cards up over that 9 power limit. And so with that, I am going to end this video here. I know this one's going to be just a little bit later than normal, maybe 30 minutes, but I edited the first video and it just did not feel where it needed to be. It didn't feel high enough quality, so I scrapped it. I went back to the drawing boards, and this is the deck that I was running, and I was running well, and it didn't feel like it had that luck element. You're able to draw into your win conditions in many different ways. So I feel much better about this being what is featured rather than the Professor X kind of deck that really heavily rotated around or relied on dropping that Professor X and then locking down the location early to be able to swing a lane late. But with that being said, I am going to end the video here. I appreciate all of your guys' continued feedback, all of your support, and just all of the comments. I love going through and responding to them as I can. It's probably one of my most favorite things as a creator, is being able to interact directly with you guys. So with that being said, I am going to end the video here. I hope you guys enjoyed it. This has been TLSG. Later, guys.